All right, chapter 22, diversity of prokaryotic organisms, kind of life cycle structure type stuff. I'll introduce them and talk about the characteristics of bacteria and archaea, the two groups of prokaryotes. I'll describe some major groups of prokaryotes, show you some nice pictures, kind of talk about some of the issues. So there's pictures of two different types of prokaryotes, Staphylococcus and a soil bacteria, Actinomycetes, which has a spiral structure, kind of neat. So we really didn't know this until recently, but bacteria and archaea, these are the prokaryotes, they're very diverse, that we couldn't grow many of them. It was hard to tell that they were so diverse because they were small and they looked very similar, and often we didn't sample enough environments. And when we look, we try to grow them using culture methods like in test tubes or on plates. And it turns out some of them were we couldn't grow them, and so we couldn't tell how many were there. But now we can use genetic methods to copy the DNA of organisms that are there and then sequence it and look for genes from their ribosomes and identify how many different types of genes were there. And it turns out per gram of soil, we find about 10,000 bacteria. And if you go to a different place, the soil is different. Prokaryotes are more diverse than any other organisms, but harder to identify. Um, when we talk about prokaryotes, there are two large domains of prokaryotes. They look very similar, but they are different. These are the archaea and the bacteria, and we divide life into three domains based on cell type. And so we're going to talk about some of the bacterial groups, some of the archaeal groups, and there's more types of these, but they don't look all that different. They're all too small for us to see. They are all unicellular. Um, all prokaryotes look kind of the same. The cells are have the same kind of organization where there's one compartment and it's just filled with cytoplasm. There's usually one DNA molecule inside. Um, the cells have a cell wall that gives them a structure. Um, they look similar, but there are some differences. In bacteria, the cell wall is made of peptidoglycan. In archaea, it's made up of a pseudo-peptidoglycan, never the same. Um, Bacteria have a single circular chromosome with one origin of replication. Archaea also usually have a single circular chromosome, but they have multiple origins of replication, kind of like eukaryotes. They differ a little bit in the types of ribosomes they have. They differ in the molecules of the cell membrane, that one of them has esters and one has ether linkages. And so there are some chemical differences, but generally the cells look pretty similar, and you can't tell by looking at them. Prokaryote cells fall into three basic shapes: a sphere or cocci, a rod shape or bacillus, and then some kind of spiral shape. And that's the three basic shapes. And prokaryotic cells are all small. They're generally all less than 5 micrometers or UMs in length. So they're generally very small. They're all unicellular organizations, so that they never have cooperation between different cell types or anything like that. When we talk about prokaryotes and eukaryotes, or prokaryotes, the different types, the first thing to look for is the cell wall material, peptidoglycan or pseudomerin or pseudopeptidoglycan, and then what type of RNA, ribosomal RNA, you find. The archaea are pretty much, those two things put you in archaea. Bacteria can also have some differences. Some bacteria have an extra cell membrane around the cell wall, and these are called gram-negative. And this cell membrane contains a material called lipopolysaccharide, or LPS, so that helps identify them. And then there's so many species we identify them into Proteobacter and non-Proteobacter, and then gram-positive. So I'm going to show you some pictures. just talk about it a little bit. So there's some mixed bacteria, and that's generally what you find them, is in groups of mixed bacteria, and they'll all look small and very abundant. There's probably 10 different species right there. Some that you may have heard of, Staphylococcus aureus is one you may have heard of. Very small bacteria found on human skin. Your book talks about MRSA, that's methicillin resistant Staphylococcus aureus. Another one you may have heard of is E. coli or Escherichia coli. That's a rod-shaped bacteria. Okay, those are some things you probably know. First of all, we're going to talk about gram-negative bacteria. These are bacteria that have that extra-cell membrane. The largest group of these are called the Proteobacteria. These are a group that are heterotrophs, chemoheterotrophs. They include some really abundant organisms like Pelagibacter, which is shown there, very small bacteria, very common in the ocean. Proteobacter, it's this large, diverse group with subdivisions that are called alpha, beta, proteobacters, things like that. They're gram-negative. Many of these organisms are pathogens, and they must take in molecules for food, and occasionally a few of them have photosynthesis. Among the Proteobacter are some really important bacteria, those that take nitrogen out of the atmosphere and put it into compounds like ammonia, so that can be then used by plants. And so like legumes, plants that are able to get nitrogen out of the atmosphere do it by having little root nodules where they grow these bacteria. And so kind of interesting that way. There's lots of these Proteobacteria, Alphaproteobacteria. You don't have to know any of those. Betaproteobacteria, again, you don't have to know any of these. You may have heard of Bordetella, that causes pertussis, Neisseria, that causes gonorrhea. They're just pictures to show you and to look. Here's another one. These are electron microscope pictures, so they look much bigger. Pseudomonas, Enterobacter, Escherichia, Salmonella, they all fall in this group, so common group. Another group here, Helicobacter, that's the bacteria that causes ulcers. Campylobacter causes foodborne diseases. These are all bacteria in the Proteobacter group, so all gram-negative cell walls, mostly rods. Okay, there's other gram-negative bacteria that aren't closely related to Proteobacter, including a very important group, the cyanobacteria. They're a group that does photosynthesis, and they are probably responsible for changing the Earth's atmosphere from a reducing atmosphere to one that we can breathe that has oxygen. Okay, and some of these non-Proteobacter gram-negative bacteria include Chlamydia and spirochetes, so some important organisms. Here's the bacteria that do photosynthesis, okay, and they can do it in different ways. All eukaryotes do it the same, but bacteria can do it in different ways, sometimes using hydrogen sulfide and releasing sulfur, other times using oxygen. The Chlamydias are bacteria that live inside cells and parasitize cells, so important that way. Spirochetes are another big group of pathogens. They have a spiral shape, and they again have this outer membrane. The other large group of bacteria are gram-positives. Okay, and these don't have that outer membrane, but they do have a thick cell wall of peptidoglycan. Some of these produce endospores, which are resistant stages that can last for years and years in soil. Clostridium produces endospores. These are some human pathogens. Some species cause botulism. Your book talks about that. Bacillus also produce endospores. Some of these are again common in the environment, and a few are associated with disease. And related to these are the lactobacillus. Some of these are used to make yogurt, and so useful for that way, although there's a couple pathogens in this group. Okay, so if you have bacteria or have a prokaryote and it has peptidoglycan, it's bacteria. If it has pseudopeptidoglycan or pseudomurin, then it falls in this domain Archaea. Okay, and the Archaea include 3 or 4 really big groups. and they're what we call extremophiles. They are found in habitats eukaryotes can't go because of high temperature, high salt content, high acidity, um, or just no oxygen. None of these guys use oxygen as a source of energy. Many of them are thermophiles. They like hot water, like in Yellow Springs, or they'll be found in sediments making methane. These some of these are hyperextremophiles, where you find them in boiling water, and so very interesting bacteria. Some of them are very close to some of the, and I call them bacteria because they look like bacteria, but they're archaea. But they share a common ancestor with bacteria. Some of these, particularly the hyperthermophiles, and so, and this is very far back, and we know this from DNA sequencing. So here's just a kind of a picture. Here's Thermoplasma acidophyllum. It's heat tolerant and pH tolerant, so it can take acidic conditions. There's the methanogen. Okay, it's an organism that breaks down organic compounds and releases methane. So there's a methanosarcini and a methanococcus. Okay, we don't run into Archaea very much because we can't go where they can go. They're found in hot springs, in sediments under lakes, at the bottom of the ocean, growing in rocks, and they're there. And there's also bacteria there as well. So, um, bacteria and archaea are both prokaryotes, but they're different. Um, Archaea, I believe, to be more similar to eukaryotes. They do a lot of things with their DNA that's similar to us. They have ribosomes that are similar to eukaryotes, um, but still pretty different from us. So we generally push archaea and eukaryotes in a similar branch of life, and then bacteria in a separate branch. Okay,